Okay, imperialism and the race for colonies. Please find this section in your notes and complete your notes with all the red text from this video in order to get stuff done. So here we go. Uh, the word imperialism, we're going to learn about that. We're going to learn about colonies, and we're going to talk about the fact that it was a race for colony. As different European nations, they all sort of scrambled and raced each other to acquire as much land as possible from other continents of the world, starting with the Americas. Okay, so European trade. By the 1500s, European monarchs, meaning kings and queens, realized that they could use international trade to increase their wealth, right? So just like we learned with Queen Isabella of Spain, who sent Christopher Columbus off to the Americas, although, of course, they did not know that they were going to the Americas at the time, other kings and queens realized that this was a profitable activity, a profitable thing to do, right? And so this became more and more popular among European kings and queens, right? And so this began the European policy of imperialism, which is a definition we are looking for in your notes. So if you look at the word imperialism, you can kind of, sort of, I think, see the word empire in there, I hope. And so this is the time in which um, different European nations are building empires. And we're going to talk about what that means. Okay, so imperialism, which is extending a country's power by acquiring new territories and establishing control over other countries and peoples. And so during this time period, Europeans realized that this is a way to make a lot of money and to become, uh, you know, sort of the leaders of the world. And so they do this as much as possible, especially in the Americas for this first time period that we're talking about. Okay, and so imperial countries did this by setting up colonies around the world. Well, what is a colony? Well, if you look at this map on the screen here, you're going to see that this was the British Empire at one point in time. And so here is Britain, United Kingdom, and all of these other highlighted countries were once colonies of Britain, right? And so what are colonies? What were they? Well, a colony is a territory under the full or partial control of another country, usually a distant country, and occupied by settlers from that country. Okay, so if you look at the map on the screen, this is a map that you can also find in your partial notes. You'll see the colonization of the Americas. So different European nations set out to colonize different parts of the Americas, right? And so you can see in green, we have territory that was colonized by the Spanish. Okay, all of that was not one colony. Okay, that green section that you see, that was a number of different colonies that were all Spanish colonies, each of which would have had a different Spanish, viceroy or a Spanish governor, some type of person who was in charge of that specific colony. But in the end, it was directly under the control of the Spanish government, Spanish monarch, right? And if you see the blue territory, that was under the control of the French, and the red territory was under the control of the British, and that sort of, what do you call that? Is that salmon or tan or something like that? That would have been under the control of the Portuguese, right? And so each of these European countries would have sent a number of military people to these places, right, to maintain control over the territory. They would have sent traders and merchants to get natural resources and try to make money off of this territory and bring natural resources back to the mother country being the European country back in Europe. And importantly, they also would have been sending settlers or colonists. These are people from the mother country, right, from the European country, who were sent to live in these colonies and to create a new country that is very much similar and designed in the same way or in a similar way to the home country, the mother country. Okay, so why create these colonies? Why did European monarchs believe that it was to their advantage to do this, right? because not every country in the world decided to do this, right? For example, China. We've talked about China a few times in this unit. China was a superpower throughout the 1400s, but yet China did not decide to go to the Americas and to colonize the Americas. Well, they had different values. They had different ideas about what they wanted as countries, right? Many European nations had sources of motivation to do this, right? They had a lot of people who needed land, so they would send them off. Europe was in need of natural resources, as you've learned, right? And China didn't see the same value in colonizing the Americas that Europeans saw, right? But the three um, things that Europeans saw as being good reasons for colonizing the Americas would be the three G's, right? Gold, glory, and God. These were their three sources of motivation for colonizing the Americas. So let's start with gold. Gold means gold, but it also just means making money, right? Wealth, right? And so that might be from getting, actual physical gold from the Americas, but in many cases it was just because there were other natural resources, or there was land for the Europeans to grow different crops, right? So you can see on the map here that there was something called the triangular trade across the Atlantic Ocean. So starting up here in Europe, we would have merchants or traders who would um, take their boats down to Africa. And with them, they would have things like textiles, they would have rum, they would have some manufactured goods, which they would sell to African slave traders. And in exchange for these items, they would purchase people who they would transport across the Atlantic Ocean into the colonies of the Americas. And these people would be sold into slavery. And they would work in different colonies, often working in plantations, as you're going to learn in future lessons. Plantations are just like really big farms where they plant certain crops, such as tobacco or cotton or sugar or other crops as well in these colonies. And then um, the slaves would then be sold to the owners of these plantations, and the plantations would then sell the traders who were driving the boats. They would sell them the natural resources or the commodities that were being grown in the colonies, which would then be brought back to Europe. So these boats would be filled up with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other things, and brought to Europe, where they would then be turned into finished products, right? Like textiles, rum, and manufactured goods. So all of this was very profitable to the Europeans, hence the gold. So colonies provided the mother country with raw materials and markets for goods made in the home country. Right? So the raw materials, these are natural resources that have not yet been shaped by humans to create a finished product that will be used by humans, right? And markets, these are uh, populations of people who will buy the products that the Europeans are making. Okay, so an example of Europeans making a lot of money off of colonization would be the Potosi mines in Bolivia. So Bolivia is now a country in South America, and you can see in the map on the right side where the Potosi mine was located, or the Potosi mines were located. And we have the Cerro Rico Mountain near the town of Potosi. And Cerro Rico means rich hill. And so this hill was filled with natural resources such as silver, right? And so the indigenous people of South America who were in the area were forcibly enslaved, and they were forced to extract extract the silver from this hill, from this mountain, and give it to the Spanish, who then shipped it back to Spain to make the Spanish king and queen more wealthy, right? And so this activity led to many people dying, right? Dying in part because They had been overworked and mistreated in inhumane ways, but also because of the diseases they were encountering from Europeans who were enslaving them, right? And so as the population of indigenous people started to drop, and as many in people who were indigenous who were enslaved started to die, Europeans then decided that they needed to replace the indigenous people with other people who could be enslaved. And that's when they start to increase their um, their importing of people from Africa to be used as slaves. Okay, next we have glory. That's the next section in your notes, right? So here, take a look at the Portuguese Empire, right? So they built an empire with colonies in South America, in Africa, and also in Asia. And so for the Portuguese, this was a source of pride, right? And for the French, they had an even bigger empire with colonies also in the Americas, Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, even part of Antarctica at one point was colonized by the French. And this was a source of pride for the French. And then the Spanish, they had a really big empire, right? At one point in time, it was the biggest empire in the world, and they called themselves the empire on which the sun never sets, right? Because at any time of day, the sun is always above one of the colonies of the Spanish Empire, right? So it was something they were very proud of. And then the British, they grew an even bigger empire, the biggest empire in the history of the world. At one point in time, 1 out of 5 people were subjects of the British crown, and almost a quarter of the Earth's entire land was under the control of the British Empire, right? And so for the British, at one point in time, this was a source of enormous pride, right? It brought glory to their empire. So monarchs believed that colonies made their nation more powerful and also more prestigious, right? And so there was this massive race between European nations. They were all seeing colonization and imperialism as a way of making themselves rich and prestigious. And so they were, all in a competition to try to acquire as much land as possible and try to make as many colonies as they can. All right, and then the third one would be God. Right, so the dominant religion in Europe at this time was Christianity. And so Europeans believed it was their job to convert the indigenous peoples to Christianity and to save their souls. Right, so you saw in the Jared Diamond video, Guns, Germs, and Steel, that the conquistadors brought a priest with them, right, to try to convert the indigenous people. They had to try to convert the indigenous people before they were allowed to take their land, right? The first thing that they had to try to do was convert them. And there was a time in which the Catholic Church approved of this, that they were okay with the idea of going out and taking land from other groups of people if it meant that attempts were being made to convert them to Christianity. And oh, I see I was a little bit behind on the slides. Sorry about that. So here we go. So God, the dominant religion in Europe at this time was Christianity. And here you go. Here are the notes for the section on God. Okay. And then moving on, indigenous peoples. So Europeans, in many cases, mistreated the indigenous people, right? So you see here a picture of Columbus and his interactions with the Lucayan people. And there was a time in which the Lucayan people were forced to bring precious metals to Columbus and his men. And any of the Lucayan people who disobeyed were were beat up and then sent to the dogs, and the dogs would devour them and kill them. Right, so they were terribly, terribly mistreated. And this is, of course, a very extreme case, but this happened in many different parts of the Americas. And there were different forms of mistreatment. There are other parts of the Americas in which the mistreatment was not as extreme. But overall, there was this belief in Eurocentrism, right? That Europeans, they had what we call a Eurocentric vision of society, right? So Eurocentrism means that Europeans believed that white people were naturally better than everyone else. Okay, so they did not yet have the science that we have today. right? So we've made progress with things like the Human Genome Project. We now understand human genetics much better now than we did back then. And today we understand that there are not really differences between different ethnic groups. And in fact, this whole idea of race, this idea of there being different races, seems to be questioned by modern science in a very big way. However, at the time, they did not know what we know today. And many Europeans believed that it was their job to uplift, to civilize, and to Christianize the indigenous peoples of different continents. And I've underlined the words uplift, civilize, and Christianize because these are useful words. They believe that other groups of people around the world were in a lower position than Europeans were, right? So they looked down at a lot of the cultures that people had in the Americas and in Africa and in Asia. And in some cases, they believe that, okay, we're going to take their land and we are going to profit. We're going to make a lot of money off of colonization, but we are going to teach these people about European civilization, and we're going to teach them to become more like us, right? And that was the goal, or that was one of the goals of European colonization. It's like we are going to teach these other groups of people how to be more European, and that is going to help them become better, right? So that's a very Eurocentric way of approaching other cultures, right? And so on the last slide, it talks, or in this slide, sorry, it talks about indigenous peoples. We're going to define indigenous peoples, right? So when we talk about indigenous people, we often think about First Nations, Métis and Inuit people here in Canada, right? And that is accurate. Those are indigenous peoples. However, there are indigenous peoples around the world. Okay, it's a general term that is used to describe the descendants of the original occupants of the lands before these lands were taken over or conquered by others. Okay, so even in Africa, there are indigenous peoples, right? So these are people who lived in a certain area before another group of people came and colonized them or conquered them in other ways. All right, so in class, I showed this picture up on the screen, and I had everybody look at it, and I had everybody use their whiteboards and use markers to come up with answers to these questions here. So I'll let you do the same. Take a minute to look at this and to learn from it. So here we have symbol of civilization, right? Which in their mind is European civilization. And they're coming and they are forcibly conquering an indigenous group of people. And there's a picture here, or sorry, there's a flag here that says barbarism, right? Which basically means from the perspective of Europeans at the time, they saw indigenous peoples as being barbarians, as being less civilized, less sophisticated than Europeans, right? So just these words like barbarism and civilization, those would be examples of Eurocentrism, right? And then here we see colonization happening, right? So they're using their weapons to take over the land and defeat the local people. And then behind them are all of these settlers, all of these colonists who are going to create a colony in this new land and turn it into more of a country that looks more like Europe. Okay, so you can take a few minutes and you can answer these questions while looking at the picture, and then you can continue with the video. Okay, so continuing on, if you were to turn the page, what do we got? This need to civilize indigenous peoples became known as the white man's burden. So we have a picture here of a man named Rudyard Kipling. And Rudyard Kipling, he wrote a poem. This is part of his poem, and I'll read it to you. It says, "Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-cut sullen peoples, half devil and half child." So let's break this down a little bit. So the white man's burden. The word burden means a responsibility. So according to this poem, white people or European people had a responsibility. What was their responsibility? Well, to send forth the best breed, the best race, right? And so they believed that the best race, the best breed was the European race. Go bind your sons to exile. So um, send our European people out to other parts of the world, bind them to exile, send them off to other continents to serve your captives' need, to serve the needs of indigenous peoples of the world, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child, right? He is describing indigenous peoples here, describing them as being half devil, meaning that they are not Christian, they are not, uh, you know, saved people. They're not people that are saved, and half child, meaning here that they are less civilized and that they don't have the same uh, types of civilizations that are found in Europe. Okay, so this poem here really shows us a lot about Eurocentrism. Okay, and then these pictures that you see in your notes also show us Eurocentrism. So here we have a picture of a man who is carrying a person who is indigenous to Africa. Right? First of all, picture of the way in which the African person is depicted is, well, extremely racist, that's for sure, and draws upon some extremely offensive stereotypes. And here you can see that this man, the European, is carrying this African person up a hill towards a school, right? And it shows you the white man's burden, right? And so the idea here is that white people, European people, have this responsibility to educate people of other continents so that they can become more like the Europeans of the world. And next, we have another picture with a similar message, but with a little bit more detail. We have a man down here who looks like he might be British, and he's carrying people from other parts of the world, right? He's carrying people who are indigenous to other areas, and he's carrying them across these things like superstition and brutality and vice, and carrying them across slavery and cannibalism and ignorance, cruelty, and he's bringing them up towards civilization so that they can learn about things like liberty. Um, and so this, of course, this picture is also one in which we see many examples of Eurocentrism, this idea that Europeans have this need to uplift and civilize and Christianize people from other parts of the world and teach them to become more like Europeans. Okay, so I think that is as far as we need to go for this video. We're going to leave it at that, and I'll see you later. Have a good day.